The day started like any other in Odd, West Virginia, but the mood around the Whitaker property felt heavier than usual. The early morning fog was still lifting when word began circulating online that something had happened, something big. A few whispers in chat groups, a handful of cryptic comments, and suddenly the rumor grew legs. APS had visited Betty again. By noon, the speculation exploded. People were messaging each other. Did you hear APS showed up? Is Betty okay? Is this about the visit she was supposed to get with Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray? Nobody knew for sure, until a single post appeared on Facebook. It was from someone who claimed to have spoken directly with a neighbor, someone who said they saw the white APS vehicle parked at the Whitakers' driveway. That was all it took. Confusion turned into panic, and panic turned into the kind of fear that spreads faster than truth ever could. In the middle of all this chaos, a video notification appeared. From Eric. People froze. It had been days since anyone heard from him. The man who was once deeply entangled in the Whitaker family story, their defender, their voice, their advocate, depending on who you asked, had grown quieter and quieter as the controversy around him escalated. Supporters waited for explanations. Critics waited for him to crack. But what they got instead was something nobody could have predicted. A message that felt final. Eric began with a long sigh, like he was already bracing himself for the backlash. He said he had been contacted by someone at APS. He didn't say who, and he didn't say when, but the implication alone sent shivers through people watching. He explained that the situation regarding Betty was more serious than anyone knows, and that APS had been conducting follow-ups because there were ongoing concerns about the condition of the home and the unresolved legal matters involving the previous removal of her siblings. He didn't elaborate, which only made everyone listening feel the weight of his words even more. Then he said something that changed everything. He said he was done. Not taking a break. Not stepping back. Done. He said he couldn't help anymore. Couldn't be involved. Couldn't keep trying to fix things that were too broken for him to repair. People immediately began typing in the chat. What do you mean you're done? You can't walk away from them now. They need you, don't do this. But Eric didn't pause. He went on to explain that he had been accused of things he didn't do, blamed for things that weren't his fault, and dragged into battles he never intended to fight. He said he had been trying to help the family for over a year and that while he understood the pain people felt, he was tired of being painted as the villain. Then he said the words that made the Whitaker supporters go still. There's nothing left I can do. I hope someone else is able to help them. I really do. But I'm stepping away, for good. That's when the comments turned frantic. Some people begged him to stay. Others accused him of abandoning the family. Many were just confused. And in the middle of this digital firestorm, something even more shocking happened. Betty's neighbor confirmed that APS had, in fact, stopped by that morning. According to them, it wasn't a short visit. It wasn't a casual check-in. It was a full inspection. APS workers walked around the property, spoke with Betty, and were seen taking notes. Visitors reported seeing Betty standing on the porch looking worried, hands shaking, not saying much. Nobody knew exactly what was said inside the house, but the atmosphere afterward said enough. Larry didn't come outside. BJ didn't come outside. Even the family dog, usually energetic and roaming, stayed close to the porch like he sensed something wasn't right. By 6 p.m., the sadness in the air was unmistakable. And that's when the stories began merging. Some viewers said Eric's message had been pre-recorded. Others believed he had filmed it after hearing the APS report. And others even suggested that Eric knew APS was planning a visit and that his video was a way of distancing himself before everything hit the fan. Whether any of that was true or not didn't matter at first. What mattered was that the family, already ripped apart by removals, investigations, and the chaos brought on by outsiders, now seemed to be losing one of the few people who had ever publicly claimed to be on their side. Supporters were quick to say, "Eric, please rethink this. Don't leave them now." But his silence after the video spoke louder than the video itself. The reaction from the online community came in waves. Some were angry. They insisted that Eric owed answers, receipts, transparency, things they had been demanding for weeks. Others believed he genuinely cared but had been pushed too far, too long. There were comments filled with compassion. "He's human. This whole situation is heavy. He tried. Maybe he really did. Everyone's falling apart, not just the family." And then there were the ones who directed all their sympathy toward Betty. Because while the online drama grew stormier, she was sitting in that small home, alone, confused, scared, after an unexpected visit from APS. People imagined her crying, wondering what she did wrong, wondering whether she would ever see her siblings again, wondering whether the state was just waiting for the right moment to take even more from her. Supporters started asking the questions nobody wanted to think about. Did APS come to warn her? Are they thinking of removing her too? Is this about BJ? Is this about the condition of the home? Is this because of all the online fighting? Every question had one thing in common: fear. And woven through all that fear was the sting of abandonment. Because at the very moment Betty desperately needed support, stability, and reassurance, Eric had said his final words and walked away. The Whitakers have endured a lifetime of hardship, but this moment felt different. It felt like the fragile thread holding what was left of the family together had snapped. And instead of answers, there were only more questions. Why did APS come back so soon? Why were they taking notes? Did they tell Betty anything? Does she know what's coming next? And why did Eric choose this moment to say goodbye? Nobody knew. But everyone felt the same sinking feeling. Whatever is coming next isn't good. As the sun set on Odd, West Virginia, a strange silence fell over the online community. People stopped arguing for a moment. The usual back and forth between Patrick supporters, Eric supporters, and neutral observers faded. All that remained was grief. Grief for a woman who has lost nearly everything. Grief for siblings who are somewhere far away, likely wondering where Betty is. Grief for a family torn apart by circumstances they never fully understood. And grief for the realization that help, real help, might not be coming. At least, not from the people who once promised it. Comment below. Hey everyone, before we get into the next part, I've got something special to share with you. If you're all about making your home smarter, cozier, and just a little bit more you, then you've got to check this out. We've partnered with Trekbo.com, a place built for people who love clever solutions and everyday comfort. From wellness and skincare must-haves to smart home gadgets, heated gear, and lifestyle tech, Trekbo is packed with products that make life easier, warmer, and way more fun. I've personally picked some of my favorite finds, things that actually work, look great, and make your day smoother. Whether it's something to simplify your morning routine, help you unwind after a long day, or bring a little innovation into your home, you'll find it there. So before you scroll past, take a quick look at Trekbo.com. Trust me, it's full of discoveries waiting to make your everyday better. Alright, now let's get back to it. Because after this video, you're definitely going to want to explore what Trekbo has in store for the Whitaker household community. The situation surrounding the Whitaker family has always been complicated, but after Eric's message and the unexpected visit from APS, things shifted in a way nobody was prepared for. The house felt quieter. Betty felt heavier. And even though the family had weathered storms before, something about this one felt different. People across social media, YouTube, and Facebook groups began asking the same question. What happens now? Because it wasn't just APS stepping in, It was the emotional weight of realizing that outside forces were now making decisions that the family used to navigate privately. And Eric's message, whatever his intentions were, left a shadow over everything that followed. Some people were supportive. Some were angry. Some were confused. Most were worried. And in the middle of all that noise, Betty was simply heartbroken. She spent most of the day after the APS visit sitting on the edge of her bed, holding one of Timmy's old shirts in her hands. She didn't cry loud. She didn't shout. She didn't curse or scream. She just sat there in silence, the kind of silence that hurts more than any argument ever could. Larry tried keeping things calm. He cooked, even though he barely touched his own plate. He picked up around the house. He walked back and forth to the road a dozen times like he was expecting someone to show up with answers. But nobody did. And somewhere between those quiet moments, the community began trying to piece together what all of this meant, not just for the Whitakers, but for the people who had been following their story for months. The community tries to make sense of the chaos. As word about APS's visit spread, so did speculation. People began asking, was APS reacting to something someone reported? Did Eric's message influence anything? Was the house inspection routine or triggered? Was the family being punished for something they didn't do? And then came the biggest question. Are they trying to separate the family permanently? For a lot of viewers, the fear wasn't just about the conditions of the home. It was about the possibility that someone might try to make decisions for the Whitakers rather than with them. And considering the family's long history of being misunderstood, that fear didn't feel unrealistic. Online discussions grew as more people weighed in. Some believed APS was stepping in for the right reasons. Others believed someone influenced the state unfairly. Some worried that decisions were being made without giving Betty a fair chance to defend herself. Many were convinced that the feud between Eric and Patrick was making everything worse. But no matter which side of the argument people landed on, the sentiment was mostly the same. We just want the family to be together and treated fairly. Betty's day after the visit. While the internet argued, Betty spent the day in a daze. She moved slowly through the house, touching things that reminded her of her siblings. She folded towels that weren't dirty. She wiped down the kitchen counters 3 or 4 times, even though they didn't need wiping. At one point, she sat quietly on the front porch and tapped her fingers on her lap the way she always did when she was nervous. Then she whispered to herself, "I don't know what they want from us. I don't know what they want." It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was confusion, plain and simple. She didn't understand the reports, the system, the paperwork, the decision-making, or the timing. All she knew was that her loved ones weren't home, and APS was now thinking about her too. That alone was enough to make her stomach twist. And despite the heartbreak, she still held on to hope that maybe, just maybe, the visit was a step toward getting answers, not a step toward losing the remaining parts of her family. The question of guilt and responsibility. One of the hardest parts of this whole saga has been trying to understand who is responsible for what. Some people blame Eric. Some blame Patrick. Some blame BJ. Some blame outsiders. Some blame the state. Some blame nobody. And that's because the truth is messy. Eric's message didn't explain the full story, but his tone suggested he felt betrayed or exhausted, or both. For months he carried himself as someone who wanted to help. And maybe he really did. But the final message came off as cold and definitive, especially when the family needed reassurance more than anything else. Patrick, on the other hand, stayed relatively quiet, which people interpreted in a dozen different ways. Some saw it as guilt. Some saw it as maturity. Some saw it as fear of saying the wrong thing. Some saw it as him distancing himself from the chaos. But no matter how people interpreted it, his silence added another layer of confusion. Meanwhile, Viewers were left trying to sort truth from rumor, and the Whitakers were caught in the middle, living the consequences. The one thing everyone agrees on. Regardless of whose side people take, one thing became crystal clear. The Whitaker family deserves compassion, not conflict. The online arguments, the accusations, the back-and-forth content, all of it was turning into a distraction from the one thing that mattered. Finding a way to bring the family back together and keep them safe. And APS's visit reminded everyone that the Whitakers weren't characters in a drama. They were real people living in real fear. Betty didn't want money. She didn't want fame. She didn't want attention. She wanted her family. And until the state gives her that, nothing else feels right. Eric's words continue to echo. Even though Eric had gone silent after his last message, his words continued to circulate across every social platform. People debated them. People analyzed them. People rewatched the videos. People questioned everything, including his intentions. What hurt the most wasn't what he said, it was the finality in his tone. It felt like the end of something important. It felt like abandonment. And worst of all, it happened at the exact moment the Whitakers were being watched more closely than ever. Whether Eric meant to or not, his message stung the family in a way that might take a long time to recover from. Brian tries to step in. With Eric gone and Patrick distant, many viewers started seeing Brian as the only person still physically stepping in to check on Betty and Larry. Some people trust him. Some people don't. Some think his motives are unclear. But he's there, and right now, being there matters more than anything else. He sat with Betty. He listened to her. He reassured her that things weren't over. He promised to keep checking on her. People debated whether his involvement was appropriate, but it didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that Betty wasn't facing everything alone. A glimmer of hope. In the evening, after a long day of silence and worry, one small thing shifted. Betty received word, unofficial, quiet, but real, that the state was reviewing her visitation request. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a date. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. And when you're hurting, something can feel like everything. She sat on the edge of her bed again, but this time she didn't look lost. She looked hopeful. She held Timmy's shirt and whispered, "I'll see you soon. I know I will." And in that moment, you could tell, she wasn't giving up. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. What comes next? The next steps depend on the state, APS, and whatever decisions come from behind those closed doors. Will Betty get her visit? Will APS return with more questions? Will the house inspection lead to reunification or more separation? Will Eric speak again? Will Patrick clarify anything? Will Brian continue stepping in? Nobody knows yet. But one thing is certain, the Whitakers are being watched. And not just by APS, by thousands of people who genuinely care what happens to them. Comment below. What do you think the state is planning next, and will the visit truly happen? The day after Betty received the small but meaningful update about the possibility of visitation, something in the air around the Whitaker home felt different. It wasn't lighter, not yet, but it wasn't as crushing as before. It was the kind of shift that happens when heartbreak meets determination. Betty seemed more focused. Larry seemed more alert. And the handful of people still checking in on them noticed it immediately. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't the state reversing anything. But it was enough to remind the family that they weren't forgotten. And after everything they've been through, that reminder mattered. The community grows restless. While Betty tried to gather her strength, the online community was growing louder. YouTube channels, Facebook groups, and TikTok creators spent the entire day trying to piece together what APS might be planning. Some argued that the state was intentionally dragging its feet. Some believed the delay meant they were preparing to reunite Betty with her siblings. Some claimed there was more happening behind the scenes than anyone was being told. Comments poured in everywhere. Why hasn't APS made a clear statement? Why is Betty being punished for the actions of others? Who upset the state enough to start this entire chain reaction? Why is Eric silent all of a sudden? Is Patrick stepping back because there's something he's not telling us? People weren't just curious anymore. They were upset. For months, the Whitakers had been at the center of online attention, and the viewers felt invested. They donated, shared, supported, and discussed. They defended the family against rumors and misinformation. They'd celebrated small victories and mourned heartbreaking updates. Now they wanted clarity. But clarity wasn't coming. So the speculation only grew. Betty's quiet resolve. Inside the Whitaker home, Betty spent the morning doing something she hadn't done since the removal, cleaning the living room with purpose. Not slowly, not nervously, but almost methodically, like she was preparing for something. Larry noticed and didn't interrupt. For Betty, cleaning wasn't about trying to impress APS. It wasn't about preparing for a surprise visit. It wasn't even about the house being in perfect condition. It was about reclaiming something she felt she'd lost, control over her environment. She dusted every corner. She straightened every blanket. She swept, even when the floor didn't need it. She reorganized photos on the shelf, lining them up carefully. At one point she stopped and stared at a picture of Timmy, running her thumb across the frame. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, and quietly devastating. But in the middle of that pain was resolve. She whispered almost to herself, "They're not going to take everything from me. Not everything." And you could tell she meant it. The growing pressure on APS. Behind the scenes, APS wasn't ignoring the noise. In fact, the growing public interest was starting to make things complicated. Local authorities had begun receiving calls. Emails from viewers were trickling into county offices. People were tagging government officials online. Some messages were supportive. Some were demanding answers. Some were angry at the idea of Betty being separated from her family without clear justification. While APS doesn't operate based on public opinion, the pressure was impossible to ignore. Workers at the agency weren't strangers to criticism that comes with the job, but the sheer volume of concern surrounding the Whitakers was something they weren't used to. Officials were now caught in a difficult position. If they moved too slowly, they'd be accused of negligence. If they moved too quickly, they'd be accused of overstepping. If they reunited the family without addressing safety concerns, people would criticize them. If they kept them apart too long, people would accuse them of cruelty. For a case already filled with unusual complications, outside pressure was the last thing they needed. Still, viewers wanted accountability. And APS knew it. The role of Eric and Patrick. Meanwhile, discussions about Eric and Patrick were far from dying down. In fact, the more time passed, the more people examined their actions under a microscope. Eric's silence was the biggest point of confusion. He'd spoken so confidently for months, sharing updates, explaining details, pushing for transparency, and now he was nowhere to be found. Some supporters defended him. He tried. People pushed him too far. He cared more than anyone else and he got burned. He stepped back because drama took over the mission. Others weren't so kind. He walked away when the family needed him most. His timing was awful and felt like abandonment. Why speak for them for months and then disappear when it got hard? Patrick's silence was analyzed just as intensely. People remembered his earlier connection to the family, the laughs, the moments with Timmy, the sense of comfort he brought. But they also remembered the feud, the accusations, and the financial arguments. Some saw his distance as self-preservation. Others saw it as guilt. Still others believed he was waiting until he had something meaningful to contribute. But regardless of which version people believed, one thing was becoming clear. Neither man was stepping forward to support Betty during the hardest moment of her life. And that reality hurt more than any online argument. Brian remains the only constant. Brian continued stopping by, checking on Betty and Larry, answering questions when he could, and staying quiet when he couldn't. He wasn't trying to take over. He wasn't trying to replace anyone. He wasn't posting dramatic content. He wasn't stirring arguments or pointing fingers. He was just showing up. And whether people fully trusted him or not, Betty appreciated that someone was willing to sit at her kitchen table and listen without judgment. During one of his visits that afternoon, Betty asked him the question that had been eating at her. "Do you think I'll see them soon? Really see them?" Brian didn't make promises. He didn't sugarcoat things. He didn't speak for APS or the state. He simply said, "I think they're trying to figure it out. And I don't think they want to keep you apart forever." It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't the answer she wanted. But it was honest. And that honesty meant something. The emotional weight of waiting. Waiting is hard for anybody. Waiting with no timeline is torture. Waiting while dealing with the fear of permanent separation is almost unbearable. For Betty, every day felt like a mixture of hope, dread, and pacing footsteps across the living room floor. For Larry, every hour felt like checking the window, scanning the driveway, and pretending he wasn't doing exactly that. For the viewers, every update felt like a small piece of a puzzle with too many missing parts. Everyone was holding their breath, but nobody knew when they could finally exhale. Online support grows stronger. As heartbreaking as the situation was, something positive began happening online. People who normally argued, debated, and fought over details started doing something unexpected. They united in support of Betty. Comments shifted from criticism to compassion. "She deserves visits. This isn't fair to her. She's heartbroken. Someone needs to help her. APS needs to work with her, not against her. We need to focus on the family, not the drama." People began sending prayers, encouragement, and messages of hope, not just for updates, but for Betty's emotional well-being. For the first time in a long while, the community wasn't fighting each other. They were rallying behind someone who needed them. An unexpected call. Late that afternoon, something happened that Larry would later describe as a moment that felt like the world paused. The phone rang, and Betty reached for it with trembling hands. She expected another dead end. Another overwhelming instruction. Another reminder of how powerless she felt. But instead, what she heard was this: "We haven't forgotten you. We're reviewing your request." No date, no specifics, no promises. But it was direct communication, and that alone felt like a step forward. Betty nodded as she listened, holding the phone close to her ear. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cry. She just listened until the call ended. Then she sat down slowly, staring at the wall for a moment before whispering, "At least they talked to me. That means something." And she was right. It meant everything. Where things stand now. APS is reviewing her request. Brian continues checking in. Eric and Patrick remain silent. The community is unified, for once, in wanting justice and compassion for the Whitakers. Nobody knows exactly what the state will decide. Nobody knows when the visit will happen. Nobody knows how much longer this painful waiting period will last. But Part 3 ends with something the family desperately needed, a spark of hope strong enough to keep them going. Comment below. Do you believe APS is finally moving toward visitation, or are they still holding something back? The morning after the phone call, the Whitaker home felt strangely still. Not silent. The old floors still creaked, the refrigerator hummed, and Larry shuffled around like he always did, but still in a way that said something was shifting. Something was moving forward. Something finally felt possible. Neither Betty nor Larry said much at first. It was as if they were both afraid to say the wrong thing and break whatever progress had begun. But the faint hope from yesterday lingered in the air, like a light that refused to go out. The world outside the Whitakers' little home, however, was far louder. The internet reacts to the update. News of the phone call spread fast. Viewers from every platform shared and discussed the new development, each trying to interpret what it meant. Some were relieved. Finally, Aya spoke to her. Something is moving. A review is better than silence. This is the first real update in weeks that feels positive. Others remained cautious. APS can take months. Don't get your hopes up. A review doesn't mean a visit. Not yet. They might just be checking boxes. And then there were those who were frustrated, not at Betty, but at the system. Why is this taking so long? She deserves visits now, not later. If nothing was criminal, why was the separation this extreme? The overwhelming theme, though, was support for Betty. People were tired of the arguments between content creators. Tired of rumors. Tired of finger-pointing. This time, they were rallying behind the person who had endured the most pain while staying the quietest. And that unity mattered more than they knew. Betty's anxious preparation. Even without a date, Betty felt compelled to prepare. She woke up before sunrise, something she rarely did anymore. She made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from her mug, her mind far from the kitchen. She didn't cry, but her eyes glistened with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She began pacing, lightly at first, then more intently. She straightened the couch for the second time. She stood at the window as if expecting a car to pull into the driveway even though she knew nobody was coming today. An empty home is loud when someone you love is missing. And for 30 days, the absence of Timmy's laughter, Lorraine's quiet presence, and Ray's simple routines had become a silence that cut through her every day. But now there was the faintest suggestion of change. So Betty held on to that. The weight of memory. Throughout the day, memories kept surfacing. Small ones, simple ones, the kind you don't realize you miss until they're gone. Betty remembered the way Timmy used to peek around the doorway when he wanted something but didn't know how to ask. She remembered Lorraine stacking cups in the same order every morning. She remembered Ray watching the birds outside the window with a smile like it was the best show in the world. Those memories were comforting, but they hurt too. As she dusted the old photo frames, she whispered to herself, "They're coming back. I know they are. Even if just to visit." Hope didn't erase heartbreak, but it softened the edges. Brian brings clarity. Later that afternoon, Brian stopped by again. He didn't come with cameras or equipment or plans to film anything. He simply knocked lightly and waited for Betty to open the door. She seemed calmer today, though still nervous. Brian stepped inside and sat down at the table with her. He didn't rush into conversation. He let her take the lead. Eventually she asked, "Did they tell you anything else? Anything about..." Brian exhaled slowly. They didn't give a date. But they did say they're working through the paperwork. That's a good sign. They don't usually say that unless they mean it. That reassurance, modest, realistic, but genuine, eased some of the tension from Betty's face. "Will they let all three come?" she asked. "If they do the visit," Brian answered, "they'll want them together. That's how they handle it in cases like this." Betty nodded, absorbing the information. "I just want to see them," she said softly. "That's all I want." Brian didn't try to offer clichés or empty comforts. He simply placed a hand on the table and said, "You're going to." And something about the way he said it, steady, grounded, made her believe him, if only a little. APS schedules an internal review. While Betty tried to stay hopeful, APS was busy preparing for something of their own. An internal review meeting on the case. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't dramatic. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was simply the next step in their process. But what made this review different was the pressure surrounding it. The public attention. The unusual online involvement. The sudden scrutiny from people who rarely paid attention to adult protection cases. Workers who normally handled these decisions quietly now found themselves reading comments from thousands of strangers analyzing their every move. One worker reportedly said, "This isn't a typical case. The eyes on it make everything slower. Not maliciously slower, cautiously slower." For better or worse, the internet had turned the Whitaker situation into something the agency couldn't treat like just another file on a desk. And that meant decisions would be made more carefully, but also more deliberately. The community waits. Again. While the state prepared for its review, viewers were glued to updates in real time. Every video, every comment, every small detail released by anyone close to the family was dissected instantly. Some viewers created timelines. Others listed out every known fact. A few even contacted local reporters in hopes of bringing more attention to the situation. People were trying, in their own imperfect ways, to get Betty heard. It had become more than a story, more than a documentary family, more than content. It had become a human situation people were emotionally invested in. And whether APS intended to or not, they were now part of a larger public conversation. A message from a viewer that changed everything. That evening, something unexpected happened. Betty received a handwritten letter, one of many, but this one stood out. The envelope was carefully addressed, and inside was a folded note written in neat handwriting. "You are strong. You are loved. You didn't fail them. The system failed you. And we will not stop supporting you until you get the visit you deserve." Betty read it once. Then again. Then a third time. She pressed the note to her chest and closed her eyes. That letter didn't come from APS. It didn't come from a family member. It didn't solve anything. But it gave her something she desperately needed. The reminder that she wasn't alone. The call nobody expected. Just before sunset, the phone rang again. Betty reached for it quickly this time, her hands trembling. Larry stepped into the hallway, listening as quietly as he could. Betty answered with a soft, "Hello." The voice on the other end wasn't cold or stern like previous calls had been. It was warmer. "We wanted to let you know that we are moving your request forward. We can't give a date yet, but we are in the process of arranging the logistics." Betty leaned against the wall for support. "So, it's happening?" she asked carefully. "It's moving in the right direction," the voice replied. "We'll contact you again soon." A word she'd waited 30 long, painful days to hear. When the call ended, she turned toward Larry. "They said it's coming," she whispered. "Not when, but it's coming." Larry nodded, tears forming in his eyes. For the first time since the removal, their home didn't feel entirely empty. It felt like something was returning, not physically, not yet, but a piece of hope, a promise, a step forward. What happens next? APS has officially moved into the planning phase. Betty knows it. Brian knows it. The community knows it. Nobody can say the exact day. Nobody can predict how the visit will go. Nobody can guarantee how long the process will take. But Part 4 ends with the one thing this family has been desperate for. The confirmation that a reunion, even a brief visit, is finally being prepared. Not a rumor. Not a theory. Not a guess. A real step. A real shift. A real beginning to something better. Comment below. Do you think the visit will happen sooner rather than later? And what do you hope APS decides next? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.